Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be with you this morning. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I appreciate Brad McNutt, for getting me in touch with you. I like Brad a lot. From what I hear, you do too. And he's a former student of mine. I taught him a little bit of Greek and a few other things. So I'm disappointed he's not here this morning, but I understand that's why I'm here. So I appreciate that. In 1 Kings 19, Elijah is scared. He's running away. He has been threatened, his life has been threatened by Jezebel. He's scared. He flees south. He's been a prophet in Israel. This is after the kingdom was split into two, and so we've got the 10 tribes up in the north and the 2 tribes in the south. We've got Israel up here and Judah down here. He's a prophet in the north. In Israel, Ahab and Jezebel. Ahab's the king of Israel in the north. But he flees down south to Judah, and then he keeps going south until he eventually gets to Horeb. In the reading 1 Kings 19, he eventually gets to Horeb, which is another name for Sinai, down near Egypt. He keeps going south. He is running away from Jezebel. He is scared. Eventually, he says, "Lord, take my life. I'm no better than my fathers. I might as well not even live." Now, let me clear something up about the way I approach this text. Some people, and I'm not criticizing this, I just approach it in a different way. Some people preach this, 1 Kings 19, as if Elijah is depressed. And they approach it from the standpoint of like clinical depression, or at least that's my understanding of how they approach this text. And they say that Elijah has been going through ministry. He has exhausted himself. He is worn out with ministry, and he has received so much opposition to that, and he is going through this dry season of his life. He is depressed. And some people will preach this passage, and they will take lessons about how to deal with depression from this text. I don't mean to criticize that approach. I myself don't see Elijah as depressed. You need to understand that for the way I approach this, that when I talk about Elijah in this text, I am not talking about depression. People who are actually depressed need help. I don't mean to belittle that at all. People who can actually be diagnosed with depression, they need professional help. Whatever psychologists and psychiatrists and medical doctors want to prescribe, maybe they need medicine, maybe they need to talk to somebody. All of that is true. I don't see it in 1 Kings 19. I say that because I have heard several sermons about depression from this passage, and maybe you have too. I don't want there to be any misunderstanding. I think depression is a real thing, and people who are depressed need help. I don't think that's what Elijah is going through. I don't think Elijah is depressed. I think he is whining. Now, partly I say that because I don't have any experience with depression. I myself have never been depressed, not literally clinically diagnosed with depression, and nobody in my immediate family has been diagnosed with depression either. But listen, I do have experience with whining. I have 6 kids in my house. I have heard whining before. I know what that sounds like. In fact, I've even engaged in it from time to time. So when I read this passage, I think Elijah's whining. That's what's going on. He flees away from Jezebel. He goes into Judah. He's getting away from her. She has threatened his life. He's trying to get away from her. He goes south. And he gets to this point and he says to God, "Take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." I wonder what he means by that. I am no better than my fathers, he says. It sort of sounds like something you might hear people say today. Well, related to that. Have you ever heard people say, I know that you have because you've watched the same movies I have, and we have seen this in movies. Maybe you know people who have said this. Maybe you have even been someone who has said this. I am going to be different from my father. Maybe it's a 17, 18-year-old, maybe a 20-year-old, maybe a 25-year-old man who reflects on his own upbringing and he says, my father did this, you will never catch me doing that. I am going to be different. My father treated us this way, I will never treat my kids that way. My father treated my mom this certain way, I am never going to do that. My father was in the habit of doing X, Y, and Z. I will never be like my father. And it turns out, when they have kids, oftentimes, now it's not all the time, oftentimes they have kids and they treat those kids the exact same way their parents treated them. They learned how to get along in life from their parents, and even if they hand up in the air and swore, I am not going to imitate my parents, it ends up they imitate their parents. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens enough that we recognize it when we see it. We recognize the pattern. And it turns out they are no better than their fathers. I can think of one movie that you may have seen because it's sort of a famous movie. It was made 50 years ago, but it is all about this. The entire theme is about this particular idea. He is no better than his fathers. That movie is called The Godfather. Some of you have perhaps seen this movie. It begins with young Michael Corleone, played by Al Pacino, and he is talking to this woman, Diane Keaton, and he says to her, my family are a bunch of mafia thugs. Don't worry, I'm not like them. I'm not going to turn out like them. My life is different. You get to the end of that movie, and you see the very last scene is him shutting the door to have a consultation with the mafia thugs that he is now the boss of. Shutting the door, his wife is on the outside. He's no better than his fathers. He had ideals, but it turns out he's no better than his fathers. He is imitating them. But what about Elijah? Can that be what Elijah meant? I am no better than my fathers? Surely Elijah is better than his fathers. I wonder what exactly he means. I wonder who the fathers are that he thinks he's no better than. I wonder if maybe what he means is the fathers, He doesn't mean literally his father, but his ancestors. I wonder if maybe what he thinks about is that the previous prophets in Israel are his fathers. Not literal biological fathers, you understand, but fathers in the ministry. And I wonder if Elijah had the idea, I'm going to be more successful than they ever were. I wonder if Elijah had the idea, those previous prophets, counseled Israel again and again, turn away from idolatry, turn toward God, and it never worked. Israel maintained their idolatry, but I tell you what, I am going to make a difference in this world. I am going to go out there and preach, and I am going to show Israel that they must worship the Lord and no other God. I am going to be more successful than my fathers were. I wonder if that's what he means. And he had this moment. 1 Kings 19 comes right after, you may remember this, the trial, the contest on Mount Carmel. That's 1 Kings 18. There are the 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah who are gathered together on Mount Carmel because Elijah has challenged them. Let us determine who the true God is. And you remember how this goes. You set up an altar, I'll set up an altar. You pray, and I'll pray. And we'll see whose God answers. And those prophets of Baal prayed and called out and cut themselves, and Elijah just made fun of them. Maybe your God is on vacation. Maybe he's in the bathroom. You've got to cry louder. He can't hear you. And finally, it was Elijah's turn, and you remember how this story goes, that the fire came down from heaven and consumed the sacrifice and consumed the altar and consumed the water in the trench around the altar. And it's a magnificent victory for God, the God of Israel, Yahweh. And it's a tremendous victory for his prophet Elijah. And the people fall down, the people of Israel fall down, and they cry out, the Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God, not Baal, the Lord is God. And Elijah has finally demonstrated the falseness of Baal worship and the rightness of the worship of the Lord. He has finally demonstrated it in such a way that no one could deny it. And the people fall down and say, the Lord, he is God. And Elijah in this moment has so much authority. He gathers up those 450 prophets of Baal and he puts them to death. He has people get out their swords and eliminate the prophets of Baal in accordance with the law of Moses. Deuteronomy 13 verse 5 says this is exactly what you're supposed to do with false prophets who are trying to get Israel to worship other gods. You eliminate the evil from Israel. And Elijah knows this, and he takes those prophets of Baal and he puts them to death. And the people of Israel, who 10 minutes earlier had been obeying these very prophets to worship Baal, now they get up their swords and they eliminate them. And Elijah has proven that Baal worship is worthless. He has demonstrated that one should only worship Yahweh, the God of heaven and earth. And he lived happily ever after. For a few minutes. Because not everyone's convinced. And he receives this message from Jezebel. I'm going to kill you, Elijah. I wonder if this is the moment that Elijah realizes I'm no better than my fathers here. I thought with this one great act, I could demonstrate for everyone the rightness of the gospel that I preach so that no one could deny it. I thought it would be easier after this. I thought once I had shown everyone that fire that came down and put to death the other prophets, I thought it would be easier after this. I thought no one could deny it. But it turns out the failure that my fathers experienced, it's the same failure I'm experiencing right now. I am no better than my fathers. Just take my life, God. I think we experience this. I at least have seen and heard people experience this exact problem. I thought it was going to get easier. I have heard people complain about issues they struggle with in life. And they will say, yesterday, it was so easy. I thought I had turned a corner. I thought I had gotten past this issue. I thought it was going to be easy from then on, and it turns out today it's hard, and I can't get over it. And they're struggling the same way Elijah is struggling. I'm no better than my fathers. Oftentimes we will, when we hear people say that, well, I'm no better than my fathers, our response often will be, I know because I've received this response from people. Oh, yes, you are. Come on, man. Be more optimistic. You are. You're not as bad. You're doing great. You're doing great. I look at you and I think you're doing fantastic. That's the way. Oftentimes that will be our response, and maybe that is sometimes helpful, but I think God's response to Elijah, I'm no better than my fathers. I think God's response is, so what? You think I don't know that? I know what you are. That's why I chose you. I knew what you were when I chose you. I know you're no better than your fathers. That wasn't the point. Elijah is running away. Why is he running away again? He is scared of something. He has received a message. The message has come from Jezebel, the queen of Israel. The message says, may the gods do to me and more also if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like the life of one of them. Now she means those prophets that he has killed. May the gods do to me and more also if I do not kill you like you killed my prophets. That's what Jezebel is saying. She has sent a messenger. She, I suppose, wrote a message, gave it to a messenger, and the messenger carried that message to Elijah and read out the message to him. This is after the contest on Mount Carmel. This is right after Elijah has commanded the children of Israel to kill 450 prophets of Baal. This is right after Elijah has prayed to God and the fire came down from heaven at his command. How would you like to be that messenger? Have you ever seen the movie, what is it? Ip Man. Have you seen the movie Ip Man? It's on Netflix. We've seen, there are about 4 of these. The martial arts movies is what these are. It doesn't really matter if you've seen the movie Ip Man. If you have seen any martial arts movie ever, I think the point will be the same. But I am thinking about this movie Ip Man. I can't remember if it's Ip Man 1 or Ip Man 2. But in the movie, Ip Man is, this is a sort of a true story. There's this guy in China named Ip Man, and he is the teacher of Bruce Lee. Okay, so that gives you the genealogy here. So this is back in World War II in China. World War II, Japan was dominating China during that period of time. Ip Man is Chinese. There's this one moment where they have the big contest. They have heard that this fella, Ip Man, is really good at martial arts. And so they get all their Japanese martial arts experts on the mat, the dojo mat, and Ip Man is there. And so one of them comes at him and he just takes care of him, beats him up real easy. Next one comes, and then all of a sudden 20 guys start coming at Ip Man all at one time, and he does his stuff. And over the period of, it takes 3 or 4 minutes, but he dispatches all 20 of those guys, and then there's one Japanese guy left to face. And I was thinking, how would you like to be the one Japanese guy left after you just saw this guy beat up 20 guys all at the same time? I think he actually did face him and got beat up the last time. How would you like to be this messenger coming to Elijah? He has just called down fire from heaven. He has just killed 450 prophets of Baal, and then Jezebel sends him to Elijah. You're going to die. I think I would be scared to death to be that messenger. But what do you make of the fact that Jezebel sends a messenger? What do you think about that? If you wanted, none of us want to kill anybody, but just imagine for a moment. You have probably watched movies and thought, well, if I were doing it, I would do it this way. Imagine for just a moment. If you wanted to kill somebody, would you send them a message first? Is that how you would do it? When back, what was it, 10 years ago, when some SEALs, I believe it was SEALs, went into Afghanistan and took Osama bin Laden, do you think they sent him a message first? We're going to get you. I doubt it. When somebody needs to be dispatched, typically you're not going to tell them first. It would sort of defeat the purpose. They're going to run away, just like Elijah did. Why does Jezebel send a message? And why does she send a guy with a message instead of a guy with a sword? Have you ever thought about that? Why does Jezebel send Elijah a message instead of just sending in SEAL Team 6? I think if you ask the question, you come up with the answer. She knows she cannot kill Elijah. He has just called down fire from heaven. He has access to a power Jezebel doesn't know anything about. Jezebel knows Elijah is out of her league. She can't actually do anything to him except send a message. That's all she's got. I think Jezebel is bluffing here. That's why she sends the guy with the message instead of the guy with the sword. She knows she can't do anything. And this guy with the message goes, and she knows, Jezebel knows, she has no power over Elijah. But Elijah doesn't know it. And after this great victory, he gets this message, and it actually scares him so that he runs away. So often, aren't we in the same position as Elijah, with access to a power that the world cannot understand, living in fear? Do y'all participate in Lads to Leaders? Do y'all go up to Nashville and do that? You don't. Well, I'm a part of a church. We went up to Nashville, and there are, of course, Lads to Leaders locations all over the place. We went up to Nashville. The theme this year was "Be strong and courageous." It was out of Joshua chapter 1, verse 9, I think. But it's all over the place in Joshua. Be strong and courageous. It's not just in Joshua. There are other places in the Bible that say it too. Be strong and courageous. And it got me thinking about that theme, and because we had to write speeches about it, and we had Bible Bowl about it, and all kinds of stuff. Be strong and courageous. I go and walk my dog sometimes on the road. You probably have a dog like this as well. I've got this little... I think this is a problem with little dogs more than with big dogs. I've got a little dog, and we'll walk down the road, and some SUV will drive by, and my little dog on a leash will start going, rah, 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 and like pulling on the leash as if the little dog wants to attack that SUV for the audacity of driving on his road. And I got to thinking about that, be strong and courageous, and this little dog is trying to be strong and courageous. Of course, it's doing it in the most idiotic way. It takes a little bit of sense for how to be strong and courageous, or in what ways to be strong and courageous, and this little dog shouldn't be strong and courageous versus the SUV, obviously. How should we be strong and courageous? You cannot think of someone ever who exhibited more strength and courage than our Lord Jesus, who, when the Roman soldiers came to get him, did not flee, knew very well that he had access to a power that no other person could understand, and because he was confident in that, he stood by, put away your swords, and went with those soldiers. Just a few minutes ago, we ate a little piece of bread, we drank a little bit of grape juice to remind us of that moment, and to call on ourselves to exhibit that same strength and courage in our own lives. Elijah has access to this power, but he apparently doesn't realize it. He runs away. He flees from Jezebel. He goes south, and eventually we get to this point at Horeb, this point that you have heard before, that God comes to visit Elijah. Picking up in verse 11, he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, I'm reading the New Revised Standard Version here, and it says, after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. We're more familiar with the King James translation here, the still small voice that came to Elijah. But before the still small voice, we've got fire, we've got earthquake, we've got wind. Why all these things? I think there's a comparison to Exodus 19, We're in 1 Kings 19, but if you go back to Exodus 19, when the children of Israel first show up at this very mountain, Horeb, or Mount Sinai, as we also know it, when the children of Israel first show up at Mount Sinai, God comes down in a thunderstorm, and there is earthquake, and there is wind, and there is lightning, and there is fire, and God comes down in the fire covered by a cloud, and Israel is scared to death. And here in 1 Kings 19, we have these same elements. But there has been a great change between Exodus 19 and 1 Kings 19. The problem is the god Baal is the god of the thunderstorm. The god Baal is the god that brings crops and controls the rain. That's how people thought of the god Baal. And so this imagery that at one time was associated with the God of Israel, Yahweh, the God of heaven and earth, the Baal worshipers use that same imagery of the thunderstorm and the earthquake and all that and associate it with this false god Baal. And so Elijah is learning now that the God he worships is very different from Baal. And instead of that imagery that had once been used, the earthquake, the thunderstorm, the fire, now he hears the still small voice, as far from Baal as you can get. Just a still small voice. I wonder if you've ever asked yourself the question, what did the voice say? Of course, we can't know that because Scripture doesn't say, but I am going to take a guess. What did that still small voice whisper in Elijah's ear? Elijah, who had been running away from Jezebel, saying, I'm no better than my fathers. Take my life. God, I am the only one left. What did the still small voice whisper in his ear? You might have your suggestion. Let me tell you my suggestion. I think the voice came and whispered in Elijah's ear, get over yourself. You think you're the only one left? You think everything depends on you? You think my work on earth would fall apart if I didn't have you? I've got 7,000 that have not bowed the knee to Baal. This whole project, Elijah, is not dependent on you. I have other options. Don't think that you are so important in my plans that I can't get by without you. You need to get over yourself. I think sometimes we need to get over ourselves, don't we? Have you ever known people that think this church would fall apart if it weren't for me? That this program would, that the plans of God would come crashing to the ground if it weren't for me? I think what that still small voice whispered in Elijah's ear is what God sometimes wants to whisper in our ear as well. Get over yourself. Not everything is dependent on one individual or even a group of individuals. Not everything in 1 Kings 19 was dependent on Elijah. Sometimes we need to get over ourselves. I actually think that we need to get over ourselves sometimes in a different way as well. Sometimes we magnify the weight of our own sin so much that we think, God can never use me. I am so sinful and so nasty in what I have done. He could never forgive me. He could never put me to use in His kingdom. If only He knew. Of course, He does know. And He still chose you. And in that way, if we think our sin is too great, we need to get over ourselves. Because as sin increased, do you remember what also increased? All the more, grace. God, the point of 1 Kings 19, what God is about to say to Elijah is, Elijah, get over yourself. Get up and get to work. I have this taken care of, God says. I've got it taken care of. You might not see how it all works out. You don't have to. What you do need to do is the assignments I have given you. I've given you 3 assignments. You need to go anoint this guy, Jehu, king of Israel. You need to anoint this other guy, Hazael, king of Aram. And then you need to go find this fella named Elisha, and you need to anoint him as your second in command and your successor. You need to get up off of your rear end and get to work. Stop worrying about all the things you are worrying about and do the tasks I have set before you. And if you don't understand how it's all going to work out, I'm okay with that. And you need to get okay with it too. You need to not live in fear. If you think you're no better than your fathers, I don't really care. So what? And stop thinking it all depends on you, but rather get up and do the tasks I have set before you. I think God often wants to say the same things to His church today. We are fortunate to have the story of Elijah to reflect on what he went through and see how it applies to us. The gospel of Christ calls us to not live in fear, to not worry about who we're better than or not better than, and to get over ourselves, get over our sin, and rest in Jesus doing the work He has assigned to us. If you want to respond to that invitation, we would invite you to do that now while we stand and sing.